on Benjamin Koperlik for his namesake, Benjamin Eugene Friedheim.
Thank you, Benjamin's mother, Amy. Our grandfather, Ben Koperlik, was a man of many parts. A scholar, a lawyer, a roue, a man about town, elegant dresser, bon vivant,
Great friend.
and really a very, very highly respected lawyer and political advisor and activist in Colorado.
Devoted husband.
Yeah,
Absolutely devoted.
yeah. Well, why don't you talk, he was born in
Right.
St. Louis.
He was born in St. Louis about 1870, the middle 1870s. His parents had come from Europe, and the story is that they'd come around 1855, which is why we use the 55 in our family to signify love. And his parents came to the country, his father, to get away from the mandatory conscription military service that after the revolutions of 1849 were being served to many of the citizens of Bohemia, from Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. And the minute they arrived in New York and went to St. Louis, and we're talking about Ben's father, he joined the Union Army because he so believed in the freedoms that America provided. And he served in the Union Army just after the Civil War.
And one story about his serving is interesting because his wife went to Boston to visit relatives. And of course, trains were all misdirected and couldn't get through from St. Louis to Boston. So for 3 years while he served...
From Boston to St. Louis.
Boston and St. Louis. And for 3 years, she wasn't aware that he was serving in the Army. Because what he did, he wrote letters from the battlefields, sent them to a friend in St. Louis, who put them in another envelope. And the envelope then was postmarked St. Louis, and they went on to his wife in Boston. So for 3 years she didn't know he was fighting for the Union Army. He returned to St. Louis after the war, 2 or 3 days before she returned from Boston, because then transportation was opened up. And the first night that they were together in bed, he couldn't sleep in bed because he was used to sleeping on the ground. So he went to sleep on the dining room table. And she went in and found him on the dining room table and woke him up and said, "What are you doing sleeping on the dining room table?" And that's when he confessed that for 3 years he'd been in the Union Army fighting during the War of the Confederacy.
1860s, yeah.
And he'd been sleeping on the ground and he couldn't sleep on a soft bed. He had to get used to that all over again. He was sleeping on the dining room table. Mm-hmm. And that's a great family story. Ben was a student who studied not only various things in the 1800s, but he also studied the violin. And he was a violinist. And he liked to tell the story that one day he was walking with his violin case, and by then he'd replaced the violin with a gun because it was a very dangerous time in St. Louis. And someone came up to him and put a gun in his back and tried to rob him. And so with that, he opened up his violin case and he took the gun out and he put it in the would-be robber's neck. And all of a sudden, he said, before his eyes, he saw what would he'd shoot the would-be robber, and he'd go to jail, being convicted of murder, and spent a number of years in jail. And he was so frightened that he dropped the gun, he ran, and he never carried a gun after that in the rest of his life.
Yeah. Now at that time there were no law schools. So after he graduated from college in St. Louis, he apprenticed to a lawyer. He worked in a lawyer's office, and that's how they learned the law. And he met his wife, who was Hattie Levy, in St. Louis,
Yeah.
and they married around the 1890s. And because Hattie, his wife, who we called Koppy, which was from Koperlik, we called Koppy, had very bad
Lungs. Very bad lungs.
and had not TB, but had a lot of coughing and asthma. Was told by the doctors that she ought to move west.
Didn't help that she smoked a pipe, which she did.
That's right.
She smoked a pipe and wouldn't stop, and that obviously was of no advantage to her lungs.
So Ben and Koppy set out to go to the west, and she was pregnant. So the first place they stopped was Perry, Iowa. And in Perry, Iowa, in 1901, their daughter was born, Minna Koperlik, who married Eugene Friedheim, your great-grandfather. But Minna was born in Perry, Iowa, and Ben practiced law there for a few years, I guess.
That's right, and Hattie had a couple of uncles in Iowa who lived in Perry, which is a reason that they were living there. And they went Mahula, which is a Yiddish word for bankrupt. They filed for bankruptcy. They had more debts than they had assets. And in those days, in the early 1900s, that was a big sin in the American society to go bankrupt. And so one reason they left Iowa to go to Colorado was, Mother said there was a lot of embarrassment in the family. The two uncles had gone bankrupt. I don't know what business they had, but it was something, and they moved to Pueblo, Colorado, where the doctor said our grandmother would have a better opportunity to survive because the air was thinner, the climate was somewhat drier, and it was a better atmosphere for her, and so they went to Pueblo, where Ben began to practice law.
Now, Ben was an only child, right? He had no brothers or sisters.
Yes, he was an only child.
His wife, Hattie, did have a sister and a brother, weren't they, in New Jersey?
New Jersey, right.
Any event, Ben started to practice law, and he actually practiced law in Pueblo, Colorado for over 50 years. And he was one of the noted attorneys. And as a young attorney in Pueblo, in one of the few Jewish families, they had to have, in order to pray, a minyan of 10. Although he was not Orthodox, he was a very Reformed Jew, they still wanted 10 men to provide a congregation. And the rabbi, who is really a teacher, was chosen. There was no ordained rabbi in the town, but chosen from among the minions, and he was chosen one year to be a rabbi.
Yeah, and one reason he was chosen was because the rabbi they had before ran off with one of the women in the congregation. And so they had no rabbi. So they picked our grandfather Ben to be the rabbi. And for 2 years, before they had another rabbi, he performed all the duties of a religious leader. He married people, he buried people, he supervised and attended all the religious obligations. And after 2 years of doing that, they went out and they hired a rabbi, and he was done. He never went back in the temple. And I said to him, Ben, how come you never go to temple? He said, for 2 years I did it all. I don't have to go back again.
He was a very prominent attorney in the city. It was a growing city at that point with two major industries. One was the Colorado Fuel and Iron, which was a big iron mill, and the other was the Colorado Institution for the Mentally Ill or the Insane. And our mother, Ben's daughter, always used to refer to it as Pueblo, Colorado, where they were the steel mill or the crazies. Now, Ben and Koppy had one other child, a son, 3 years younger than Minna, named Isaac Koperlik, who later changed his name to Robert I. Copper. And that's a story in itself, but that's when Bob Copper was in Cleveland practicing law. But getting back to Ben, at one point he was a city attorney and he was very prominent, a Republican in the town.
Well, you got to describe what a city attorney is. He was, though not part of the government, he apparently represented the city in legal issues where actual city officials could not do it. And he held that job for a couple of terms, didn't he?
Yeah.
And he became an extremely prominent and successful lawyer in Pueblo. And the first thing he did with his clients when they came out to his office was to open the bar. He had a little portable bar in his office. And the first thing they do was sit and have a drink. And they chat about the case. And he became quite well known. And to further his practice, he joined every kind of organization that he could where he could find clients. So he became a member of the Masons, of the Rotary, of they invented one called the Footprinters, which was with the legal establishment, with various police officials. And he used to go out every night to a different organization and have good fellowship and have speakers and talk about the community, and that's how he picked up his clients, by meeting people in town.
Now, as a Mason, one achieves various levels of prominence within the Masons, various degrees, by memorizing certain passages, the Bible, going through certain secret rituals. And you earn up to 32 degrees being a Mason, and then if you are appointed, and very few are appointed to the last degree, which is a 33rd degree Mason, it's quite an honor. And Ben became a 33rd degree Mason. He was also very active in where he did the toast, the Elks.
Well, yeah, let me say one thing about it. He became a 33rd degree Mason, the same class that President Harry Truman, who was the president following Roosevelt, went in with the same class. They had classes. And he would tell his Republican friends that Harry Truman went in with him, and he'd tell his Democratic classes that he went in with Harry Truman. So he was a very clever politician. As a matter of fact, he was very well known within the Republican Party. And at one time, and he told me this story, this way I'd be saying, Davy, if it hadn't been for one dumb son of a bitch, you would have been the grandson of a governor of the state of Colorado. Apparently there was a Republican convention to pick a candidate to run in the gubernatorial election. And they were deadlocked between two candidates. And they couldn't decide and couldn't get the votes for either one. So one of the politicians stood up and said, how about Ben Koperlik from Pueblo? He's a very well-respected lawyer and make a good governor. And Ben said, then some guy stood up from Pueblo and said, I talked to Ben, and Ben said he'd never run for public office. So if it hadn't been for that dumb son of a bitch, I'd be governor and you'd be the grandson of a governor.
Ben's word is his bond.
Yeah.
And he said Ben's word is
his
his
bond, and he said he never would run for public office.
If it hadn't been for him, I would have been governor. And he might have been.
He was an extremely good lawyer. At the age of about 75, he had a major case with the federal government. There was a woman in Pueblo who ran a bawdy house, who ran a house of ill repute.
House of prostitution.
House of prostitution. And she had lived with a man for about 10 years. Now the common law rule was if you live with someone for 7 years in Colorado, then you're legally husband and wife. They were not legally husband and wife, but they lived together for 10 years. He died. He had a substantial estate. The government claimed the estate could be claimed by the government, and she claimed that she had the right to that estate as a common law wife, having lived with him for 10 years. Well, the case went to a federal court in Denver, and Ben went down to try that case, and he was 75, and he said to me, Davey, I thought I lost my faculties, but guess what? I beat the government. He won the case. He'd gone down with a bunch of cronies, and they celebrated for 3 days and 3 nights in the Brown Palace Hotel because he'd won this case for this woman, and apparently it was a landmark case in terms of beating the government. So he's a good lawyer.
he joined the Elks, which was sort of a brotherhood club, and the Elks had a tradition of having a toast at 11 o'clock in the morning. And they asked Ben to write the toast for one of the occasions. And he wrote out what he called the 11 o'clock toast. And you have a copy of the
Yes.
of the original.
I've got the original.
And the toast to our absent brothers, became the toast that was given throughout every Elks club in the United States. And even today, at 11 o'clock in the morning,
To give that toast.
they give the toast that was written by Ben Koperlik, and we have the original writing, which we will give to you, which we'll leave to you. And
And I'll tell you
Yeah.
how meaningful that is. At one time, I was in business executive with a canned goods company, S&W canned goods. And chief executive officer of the company, a man named Frank Canonica, was a member of the Elks. And I had occasion once in his office to be discussing my grandfather, and I told Frank that my grandfather Ben had written the 11 o'clock toast. And Frank got tears in his eyes. And he said, that is the most sacred oath and commitment that the Elks make, and he was enormously impressed. So you come from a lineage that has had a significant influence in a number of things in the American society. Something else about Ben is interesting. He was an inventor. He actually
That's right.
built a shower in the basement of their home in Pueblo, and he liked to say it was the first shower ever made in Pueblo. And he had a number of things he tinkered with. He was a very creative guy.
one of the things he invented was a shirt collar that didn't need a top button. Remember that?
Yeah,
Put a little tab on it,
That's right.
so that even if it came apart, you could still see the fabric. That was one of his. Another of his inventions was, remember, counting sheep. Do you remember that? A little stand that a little
No, I don't.
paddle. It's like a paddle. You hold it in one hand, and you rotate. There's a bunch of sheep on it. You rotate it. He always had trouble going to sleep,
Yeah.
so he invented this thing and it had sheep printed on it. And every time he went around the
didn't
top,
know
he
that.
counted another sheep.
I didn't know
So he counted sheep to go to bed. I wish I had that. I still.
He was a lawyer. He was a inventor. He was a political factor. In fact, I'll tell you a political story. He was a Republican and liked to brag when he was visiting his daughter, my mother, and my father about his political activities, particularly because they were Democrats. And he talked about one election they had when he and some of his cronies went down to Trinidad, Colorado, and there was a big Greek community there. And he bragged that they went and bought the Greek vote for $1 a vote. And my father had a fit to think that his father-in-law would manipulate the political system by buying votes for the Republican Party.
Ben was a great combination of scholar and Falstaff. And your mother will tell you about Falstaff, who's a Shakespearean character. But Ben wrote treatises like the 11 O'Clock Toast and others that were scholarly. He also was a very avid reader. And there were certain books that he loved, and he'd read over and over again. One of them was The Count of Monte Cristo, which he told me he read maybe 21 or 22
Is that
times.
right?
I remember once when he was visiting our house, he would go to bed awful late. He had a tough time sleeping, and he'd be reading, and every night he'd read in bed. So one night about 12 o'clock, I looked in his room and the light was on, his eyes were closed, and his open book was The Count of Monte Cristo. I took his glasses off and put the book away and turned out the light and put him to bed. Now Ben had a lot of infirmities. He had a hernia, and in those days a hernia was not repaired surgically, but one wore a brace
A
for
hernia
a hernia.
is a tear in the groin of the muscle. And your great uncle David has had two of them. One repaired when I was in the Army.
Yeah, that's right.
And one was repaired a couple of years ago.
Your grandfather hasn't had one yet.
Well,
But Ben had a hernia, and so did Boyd. So did
Boy had double.
his
Our other
great-
grandfather had double
Your
hernia.
other great-grandfather on your Eugene's side had double, Eugene's father. But Ben had a hernia, so he wore a brace, which went around his belt and had two sort of pressure points that were put on the
Held the
tear.
tear in the
That would
hole.
hold the tear from dropping into his intestines.
That's right.
But then he also had false teeth. Because in those days, they didn't fix teeth the way they do today. They didn't have fluoride, they had a lot of cavities, and when they had a bad tooth,
They pulled
they
it.
just pulled it. In fact, there's a story about your great-great-grandmother, in which, I'm not sure if it was in St. Louis, I think it was in Pueblo. She went to the dentist with a tooth that hurt, and she said, what can you do for it? He said, well, for $2 I can put a filling in, and for 25 cents I'll pull it. So she said, pull it.
Is that right?
And they pulled it to her tooth because they didn't have enough money. And all of your great-great-grandparents, I'm not sure about Carrie, but
Carrie had a couple of false teeth.
yeah, but all of your great-great-grandparents had false teeth. In those days, they were full. Ben had a full set, so he'd take his teeth out and put them in a glass of cleaning mixture every night.
Okay.
So he'd take off his truss. That's what they called the hernia belt, the truss. He'd take out his false teeth. He would take off his glasses. He had a lot to do before he went to sleep.
He was in the hospital twice that I know of. I can't remember the specific cause. The first time he went in, he took the complete works of Carl Sandburg. Carl Sandburg was a historian and a writer who chronicled the Civil War and Lincoln's presidency, and he's a very, very wonderful writer and a great historian. And Ben read the editions of Carl Sandburg. A second time he was in the hospital, he took the complete works of William Shakespeare, the greatest playwright that ever lived, and he read those.
Now I said he was a combination of scholar and Falstaff. And the Falstaff side, you heard a little bit about his drinking, his celebrating, but he was also a great lover of life and women in terms of, he was very faithful to his wife, but just
More than that,
for that.
he was, they had a very loving, passionate, and romantic marriage. Hattie and Ben were deeply in love, and my mother told me they were a very good couple. She died at a very young age. She was in her 50s.
Yeah.
How old was Hattie?
It was 1943, so she was in her
Early
late 50s, early 60s. Maybe she was 60.
I don't think she was 60. I think she was late 50s. But she died tragically because she was too young and she'd been in failing health. And when she died, there were thousands of people all over from Colorado that came to that funeral. That's another story. But Ben grieved for her for many, many years. But then he dated other women. He was very popular. He had a group of male friends that he traveled with. He was always a man who surrounded himself with companions who adored him because of his wisdom, his humor, his good sense of fair play. And he had a whole group of friends in Colorado that used to travel together after Hattie died.
And when he came to Cleveland to visit from Colorado, he would always do two things. He would have a big lunch down at the Oak Room, remember?
Yeah.
Downtown for the family. And he would also, with a man who married into his son's family, they would go to the Burlesque Theater, the Roxy Theater in Cleveland, and see the burlesque. He loved that.
That was a guy named Milt Witter, and Milt Witter was a columnist for the Cleveland Press. And
He was the brother-in-law of Ben's son.
yeah, that's right.
Brother-in-law of Ben's son.
And Ben liked to have a drink, and he would during the day he would have an ounce of Canadian Club in a glass of warm water, and he would do that 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day during the day. I never saw him inebriated. I never saw him out of control. I never saw him in a situation where he wasn't totally in charge of his faculties. But this was something he did from when he got up until he went to bed. And one day, Milt Witter, this friend who was a columnist of the newspaper, challenged Ben to a drinking bout. He said, "You're such a good drinker, Ben. I bet I can outdrink you." And so after one of their lunches, they began to drink, and apparently they drank for 2 hours, and it ended up that Milt Witter passed out, and Ben had to take him home in a taxi and deposit him at home, and Ben came back to the house sober as a judge.
Well, which is another story. When we were, you know, Dave and I were 16 or 17, right? I guess we were just 17. Ben invited us to go on a trip from Pueblo, Colorado to Salt Lake City. Now, Ben's best friend in Pueblo, Colorado, among all his cronies there, his best friend was Ralph Mandarino. And Ralph was the owner of a bar and grill, the Oxford Bar and Grill, which was a bar in downtown Pueblo. And Ralph Mandarino had gone to school with, or was a friend of Bracken Lee.
Bracken Lee, the governor of the state of Utah.
And they were going up to have an interview to meet Bracken Lee. And they were going to drive a car from Pueblo to Salt Lake, and invited, Dave and me to go along. And Ben, Ralph Mandarino, and his wife Nola, and David and I went in the DeSoto Suburban.
Against my mother's better judgment, my father said the boys have to grow up at some time. Our sister Joan had been married earlier that summer, so Ben said, "You guys come out and I'll take you." Ben was a great investor. He always thought he could get rich investing in things, and he bought gold mines and oil wells and oil shale. As a matter of fact, your grandfather and I own now property in Utah that has oil shale, and that's shale bearing oil. And Ben said, "I want the boys to see the oil shale in Utah,
Oil shale land, yeah.
land that I own, on the way to Salt Lake City to see Bracken Lee."
And the processing plant that changed the shale into oil in Rifle.
Exactly.
So we drove up. Now, as we drove, we had a lot of fun incidents. One of them was that we were driving along the highway, and the railroad track was parallel to the highway. And Ben and Ralph looked over to the railroad, and they saw the train, and they said, "By gosh, that's Tut." Tut, who was the railroad engineer.
They speeded the horn.
How do you know it was Tut? So they start beeping the horn.
He toots back.
And Tut, who's driving the train, toots back at him. On the way to Salt Lake, we stopped when we stopped in a town, we went into the bars. And as we said, Ben liked to drink. And we stopped at every bar, going between Pueblo and Salt Lake. And every time we stopped at a bar, where they knew the bartenders.
They knew them all. They knew a guy from the Kansas City mob. We went and had a drink at his place. We went to Leadville, Colorado, where our father, your great grandfather Eugene, was born.
You were named after Eugene.
We saw the house he was born in, and we went to a bar there. And Tut's brother was the guy that ran that bar.
That's right, Tut's brother.
And after we had a drink, he said, "We got to show you something. We got to show you something that is just magnificent." So we went to the back room, and it was a gambling establishment, and they pulled back a sheet, and here was a roulette table.
Oh, yeah.
And they looked at it as if it was the Mona Lisa. Now, the Mona Lisa is one of the greatest paintings in the world in the Louvre in Paris, France, and they oohed, and they awed, and they sighed, and they gasped, "What a beautiful roulette table." Don and I looked at each other, roulette table. What the hell is this?
They would not let us drink at the bar. We were 17, or almost going to be 17. We were too young to drink, really. The law was 21. So we go in the bar, although Ben, I'm sure, could have gotten us drinks if he wanted to.
Anything.
We said, you cannot drink, and I always had limeade in those bars. Well, we went up to St. Louis.
No.
It's to Salt Lake.
No, before we go to Salt Lake, we go to Rifle, Colorado.
Oh, yeah, I went to Rifle.
The purpose of the trip, my grandfather told my parents, our parents, was to see this plant. And Ben always dressed magnificently. He had clothes made in England. He had suits and coats made in England. We walk into the Rifle plant, the processing for the oil shale, and Ben is in a 3.
All right.
So
Going to Salt Lake.
So we're going to the processing plant in Rifle, and this is what Ben had said to our parents that we could see this plant. So we walk into the plant, and Ben announces, "I'm Ben Koperlik, Pueblo, Colorado. These are my grandsons. Tell them all about the oil shale." So the manager of the cracking plant described the process, talked about the oil shale. And then he said to our grandfather, "Would you like a tour of the plant?" And Ben said, "Well, how long will it take?" He said, "About 45 minutes. Ben said, "Don't have the time. We have a date with Bracken Lee, the governor of Utah. We don't have time for the tour. Let's go, boys." we come
Went all the way.
we come 2,000 miles. But Ben was so anxious to get to Salt Lake City and party with Ralph Manarino's family. 45 minutes he couldn't spare. So he said, "We don't have time. Come on, boys, let's go." And we took off.
Went all the way. So we got to Salt Lake, and Ralph handed us the keys to the car. It was his car, I guess.
Yeah, it was his.
And it says,
Suburban.
"Boys, he had a couple of cousins there, dates for us, and said, you guys..."
Nieces, they were nieces.
Said, "You guys go out, we're there for 3 days, and we're in the Hotel Utah.
Hotel Utah.
Lovely rooms.
We had adjoining rooms
That's why they were joining, I
in
guess.
the Hotel Utah.
We had our room. And we went off. We went to see the copper mine and the God knows what with these gals showing us
Took him the
around.
movies.
Went to see the greatest movie night at an opera.
They partied for 3 days. Ben was revered as this great lawyer in Pueblo, the friend of Ralph and Nola Mandarino, and they had 3 days of lunches and dinners. And the date with Bracken Lee was for one early afternoon on the second day. And Don and I went out that morning to see something, and we came back to the room, and there was Ben in his room, and it was about 11:30, 12 o'clock. And they'd had a party that morning, and Ben was feeling very good, and he came into the room and he said, "Guess what, boys?" He said, "We had a party this morning, and we missed the goddamn appointment with Bracken Lee." So they stood up the governor of Utah.
Oh, they drove all the way
Drove
there.
away there to see the governor.
They never got it.
Never saw the governor, never saw the cracking plant in Rifle, but they had 3 days of great parties.
So every bar on the way between.
And I'll tell you how we ate. Ben did spend one day with us and took us to the Mormon Square. Now, the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, are a very powerful church in Utah, actually runs the city of Salt Lake, and they have a beautiful temple there and a tabernacle. The tabernacle is acoustically perfect. You can hear a sound anywhere in the building. You drop a pin on the stage, you can hear it all over. You rub your sleeve, you can hear it all over.
Ben rubbed his sleeve, I remember that.
So we're sitting in the audience. It's empty, of course, and we're sitting way back, and Ben is telling us how beautiful it is, and we should listen. And there's a tour group on the stage. The stage was a good, I would say, 30 yards, 40 yards ahead of us. Ben is sitting between your grandfather and I, and all of a sudden, there's rolling thunder in the tabernacle. Our grandfather had fallen asleep, and was snoring. And on the stage, they stopped the tour guide. It was so loud, to wondering what was this rumbling thunder coming. And we were afraid to wake him up. We looked at each other and we said, we can't wake him up, he's our grandfather. And he slept for a few minutes and snored, and
Now,
when he woke up, we left.
now David said that your great-great-grandfather, Ben, was an investor. He loved to invest in the oil shale, which he said would make him rich, and a few years later said it would make his children rich, and a few years later said it would make his grandchildren rich. I don't think he ever had a chance to say his great-great-grandchildren rich.
Yeah.
Gosh knows. In any event, he once invested in a gold mine in Florence, Colorado. And he was so excited about the prospect of finding gold that he put a phone line from the gold mine right to his bedroom in Pueblo. And he had a phone there next to his pillow. And he was waiting for weeks to have that phone ring, because he said, as soon as you strike gold, call me up. Well, the phone never rang. Never rang.
He invested in 2 gold mines outside of Cripple Creek, actually in Victor, Colorado. And we still own that property. And when I was a single bachelor, I guess that's where you said redundant.
You were single again.
I did take a lady once to Colorado to see that land, and they're just big hills.
Did you have time to see it, or did you have to rush away?
No, we saw the hills, and we still own it, but we've done nothing with it. Ben was devoted to his children. My mother, he was crazy about my mother, called her Smiggy, and his son Isaac, known as Bobby, and Bob's wife, his first wife Carolyn. And what Ben used to do in his later years after our grandmother passed away, whenever he had a successful run of legal issues that he won, and he would have some money, he'd call up my mother, and he'd say, Smiggy, I just made some money, I'm going to take you to New York. And he would come to Cleveland and pick up my Aunt Carolyn and my mother, and they'd go to New York for 2 or 3 days, and they'd see shows, and they'd have nice dinners, and they'd tour around New York. Mm-hmm. And he loved to entertain. He was a wonderful, wonderful, very generous host. And your grandfather and I were treated by our parents once to a trip to Europe when we were college students in 1953. And Ben came to New York with Mother to meet us when the ship came in. Mm-hmm. And we went to Keen's Chop House.
That's right.
For dinner.
Where we stayed? You know where we stayed?
Where did we stay?
The Waldorf Astoria.
The Waldorf? Liz and I were just at the Waldorf. We just stayed there.
We stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. Remember that?
No, I didn't remember that just now.
That's where we stayed.
Ben was just fun to be around.
Always the master of ceremonies
Yeah.
of every occasion. Always the spokesman. Always told jokes, many of them off color, but always the life of the party. But we had said that he was very devoted to his wife, and when Copy died, rather young, of course Ben never remarried, but he was very sentimental, very sentimental person. And he always carried around in his coat pocket his wife Copy's powder.
Oh yes, great
compact.
story. Yeah,
They call it a compact.
Yeah, great story.
It was a powder that people would use to powder their nose, a compact. And one day, Ben and our mother, his daughter Minna, were in Detroit visiting some relatives. And the man, cousin, and his wife were having lunch with them. And this man, all through dinner, all through the lunch, was making wise remarks and being obnoxious, wisecracks. And when, as was often the custom, near the end of the meal, the 2 women said, I think we'll go and powder our nose.
No, they did at the table.
No, they went. They went to
did.
the ladies' room. They got up, excused themselves, and went to the ladies' room. So they said, "I think we'll powder our nose." So this cousin, I forget who it was, looks at Ben and says, "Ben, let's powder our nose." And the women were powdering theirs. Ben looked at him with a very serious look on his face and said, "You know, Joe, I think that's a good idea." He reached into his pocket, pulled out Copy's compact, opened it up, took out a little powder and started powdering his nose. Put it back in his pocket.
The guy didn't talk again for an hour.
He was that
The guy didn't talk. But Ben occasionally would do that.
Yeah, because he didn't like it.
He didn't like a shiny nose,
and he
would pull the compact out and would powder his nose. And
Ben didn't stand on ceremony.
Yeah, the wonderful thing about it, he wasn't embarrassed by this. I mean, he had he was so self-possessed and self-confident that he could do that without being embarrassed in any way.
Now, when Ben was in his 70s, he had an aneurysm behind one of his knees. An aneurysm is when the artery puffs up, is weak, and the blood rushing through it puffs up like a weak part of a balloon, and it ballooned out. And when it happened, he went to the hospital, and the only way they could save his life was to amputate his leg, because there was just no way to repair that at that point. So he had his leg amputated.
But before the doctor had said, "Ben, I think we're going to have to remove your leg," and Ben said, No, I don't want you to remove my leg. I don't want you to remove my leg. And the doctor said, "Ben, if we don't remove your leg, you're going to die." Ben said, "Take it off right away."
And so they amputated his leg just above the knee. And he learned he tried to learn to walk with a prosthesis, with a false leg, which actually got in Cleveland, because he recovered in Cleveland. It never worked real well, but he did try to use it with crutches. Back in Pueblo, he went back to Pueblo after he recuperated, and he got a little golf cart. And he would ride around the town in his golf cart, mainly down the main. He'd
go right down the middle of the street in Pueblo, Colorado, with cars whizzing past him on both ways.
They'd stop. They'd make way for Ben. We were out there once. I was out there once, and I was wheeling his wheelchair. He rode in a wheelchair, and into the Oxford Grill. And I took him in the grill. In the front entrance, there was a long bar, and as we came into the grill, all the old men sitting at the bar looked at him and took their hats off.
Some stood up.
So took their hats off. And I wheeled Ben by, and they all nodded their heads and put their hats back on after he passed by. We went in the back room where we always went. Also, there was a story about Ben going to his office after he had lost his leg, and he was on crutches. And he was the elevator operator, at that point elevators had elevator operators, was taking him up to his office on the 4th floor. And between the 2nd and 3rd floor, he pushed the stop button, he stopped the elevator. He turned around, and Ben had known him for 30 years. He said, "Ben, I want to show you something." He lifted up his pant leg, and he had a false leg, wooden leg, prosthesis. And Ben said, "My God, I've known you for 30 years. I've never known you had a false prosthesis." And that made Ben feel much better that he knew someone that had the same problem. And he practiced law for a few more years after that. Right. But then in his later years, in his 70s, late 70s, he moved to Cleveland because he had no relatives in Pueblo. And my mother and uncle, his son, took care of him. But let me tell you about Dora Anderson. Dora Anderson was the housekeeper for Ben and Copy for
30 years.
40 years. And we knew her as a young boys going to their house, and she would always
wonderful
prepare the
cook.
meals,
wonderful cook,
and take care of the house. And after Copy died, she continued to take care of Ben. She actually came to Cleveland, I think, and helped take care of him, but then she wanted to go back to Pueblo. But Dora Anderson was a wonderful, wonderful person in the life of Ben Koperlik, and revered.
There were a few vignettes about Ben that we should mention. One, he had a great sense of humor, loved to tell stories, and was always the center of attention at dinner parties and at social occasions. And when our sister, Joan, got married,
Going to tell him this?
tell this.
Go ahead.
and sitting at dinner table one night, and in those days everyone came to dinner. It was a formal occasion, and a lot of conversation, and many guests. And Joan and her husband were there, and Ben looked across the table at him and said, "You two look very tired. You look a little tired." And they were looking a little uncomfortable, and he said, "You know something? Too much night work." Too much night work, which embarrassed our father very much.
Well, I thought you would tell about the time after the wedding. They were. He was sitting at the table where the rabbi was.
He told a dirty joke to the rabbi.
Right.
And, wait a minute, was that Joni's wedding or my wedding? That's my wedding.
Was it your wedding?
That was my wedding. That wasn't Joe's wedding, that was my wedding.
Ben was alive at your wedding?
Ben
Oh,
was,
sure, of course.
Ben was alive at my wedding. At my wedding, my first, which I've had two or three, Benjamin, it was at Cleveland, in the house in Cleveland, and my father came up to me laughing hysterically, tears running down his cheek, and he said, "You can't believe what's happening. Your grandfather Ben is telling the rabbi dirty jokes." And that was a very distinguished rabbi. Abba Hillel Silver was a great rabbi. Ben was instrumental in many parts of our lives. I was a competitive swimmer in high school and college, swimming for the swimming team, and Ben claimed that he was the reason that I could swim. We went out to Broadmoor Hotel for a vacation, and Ben loved to go to the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, and we had adjoining suites, and they had an indoor pool, and I'd gone down there to swim, and apparently I was a little hesitant about going in the water, and he threw me in the water, or forced me to jump in the water, and he said that he was responsible for any achievements I had in competitive swimming, because he threw me in the water. You know that story?
Sure.
He also kept an inventory of wine at the Broadmoor, and he was a great man for ceremony, and symbols were very important. So when we ate at the Broadmoor, our father wasn't with us on this trip. Mother, Joni, Ben and I, and Don, of course, and we were eating in the dining room in a little raised place in the Broadmoor.
Yeah.
And the waiter came over and said very ceremoniously, "Mr. Koperlik, would you like a bottle of wine from your own inventory?" And Ben said, "Yes, I would." Like a potentate from a Middle Eastern country. Ben knew how to play that perfectly.
Now I got to tell a story about Gallup, New Mexico.
Oh yeah, that's a great story. Yeah.
In 1947, we were, 14 or 15. The family, took a trip through the Southwest.
We were 15 that summer.
We were 15 that summer. We took a trip through the Southwest. And it was our family, which was Minna, Eugene, Joan, Dave, and Don, and Ben. And we did it in Ralph Mandarino's DeSoto Suburban.
We had a Suburban.
Three tiers of seats.
Yeah, that's the same car we took 2 years later when we went to Salt Lake City.
So we, in this trip, which we went to Grand Canyon, we went to Petrograd Forest, to the Painted Desert, we went to Gallup, New Mexico for the Intertribal Ceremonial, which was a 3-day event, a marvelous time, which they still have, and hopefully your mother may take you there, which every day, at 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a parade of the Indian tribes, maybe 30 Indian tribes or 60 Indian tribes coming to Gallup, New Mexico for this ceremonial in mid-August. And at 10 o'clock in the morning, they had a parade, and at 2 they'd have a rodeo, and then at 8 they'd have the dance. The Indians would dance, and they'd compete. So we were there, and the Indians were staying, we were in a motel, and the Indians were staying all over the place. They'd sleep in the lobby of the motel.
Sleep on the street,
There
sleep
were
everywhere.
tents all over. We went to in the evening, we went to the ceremonial dance, and they announced during the ceremonial that after the dance there would be a squaw dance in the parking lot. So the squaw dance was actually for Indians, and most of the people, most of the whites left. They went back to the hotel, but Ben said, we've got to stay for the squaw dance. It's amazing. Squaw dance is when the women of the Indians, the squaws, would invite the men to dance. And we were standing in a group watching this dance when an old Indian woman came up to Ben and says, "You dance with me." And Ben said, "No, I don't dance." He said, "You dance," and started grabbing him. And he said, "No, no."
In his three-piece
The only
suit.
time I ever saw Ben with a fear in his face.
Intimidated.
My father, Eugene, pulls out a $5 bill
Gave it to her, we
and
left.
gave it to her and said, "Thank you," and left, and that called him off Ben.
We would visit Ben after he became widowed. We would visit him separately. Don would come out and I would go out and we'd spend a week with him in Colorado.
Well, we trained. One would be in Denver with
Yeah.
Dad's folks, and one would be in Pueblo with Mom's folks.
It was always fun to be with Ben. Not only would we go out with all of his cronies and have a wonderful time, but sitting and talking to Ben was always fun and interesting. And he told me a story about how after Copy had died, our grandmother, some 10 years later, there was a ring at the front door. And he went to the door and there was a Mexican man standing at the door. And he said, "Is Hattie Koperlik here?" And Ben said, "No, she passed away." And he fell on his knees and began to weep. And he said, my grandfather picked him up, brought him in the house. He said, "Why are you crying?" He said, "When I was here 10 years ago, we were living, we were so poor, we were living in the park, and we had no food. And your wife came and brought us food and clothing for the children. And I went back to Mexico and I earned enough money to come back and thank her, and now I found she's dead." And Ben said to me, "You know what I did that night, Davy? I got drunk. I got drunk because I missed your grandmother." He was enormously devoted to her.
She was known as the Angel of
The
Pueblo.
Angel of Colorado, of
The
Pueblo.
Angel of Pueblo. Now, what we used to do is, when we were young children, is used to love to be with Ben. And Ben had a habit of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, doing abstracts. Now, abstracts were really leases. I guess that he was looking over the leases as an attorney and fixing them up. And he had all the leases wrapped in rubber bands.
Yeah.
And we would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. We'd
Watch
insist our parents wake us up so we could watch Ben do abstracts. And we would sit at the table. We were probably the age that
12.
you are making this tape. We were 5 and 6 years
No,
of
older
age.
than that.
We
We're
were
older than that.
as old as that and then
Yeah.
older. But we would sit and watch, get up early in the morning and watch Ben do abstracts.
There was a side of Ben which was always exciting because, as Don said, he used to go to the burlesque house and see the strippers. He had a group of buddies that he traveled with, and they ate in good restaurants, and they drank, and they enjoyed themselves, and he loved to go to the theater. He loved opera. So he was a very well-rounded scholar and Falstaff. There was a procedure we used to do in Pueblo that he had old friends, and we used to go out and see them. Whenever we were there, he would take us out to see Charlie Freund and what was her name, and his wife.
Charlotte Freud?
Yeah, Charlie Freud.
And Charlotte Freud? Was
Yeah.
it Charlotte as well?
And
Bertha Freud.
Bertha Freud.
Bertha
And
Freud.
Bertha's sister, Anna Dodge, lived with them. Now, in those days, when you were single, either a man or a woman, you lived with your brother or sister who was married. The people didn't live alone the way they do today. Single people didn't live alone. And Anna Dodge lived with Charlie and Bertha Freud for 30 or 40 years. And every time you go to their house, Anna Dodge would answer the door. And she was one of the drabbest, saddest looking women you could ever imagine in the world. Thin,
Wayne.
gaunt, and always a sad look on her face. And we went out to see them, and as they say, your grandfather and I had a wonderful time whether we'd been together or separately. And this time we went out together. We were in Pueblo together. And we went out, and sure enough, Anna Dodge answered the door and announced us, and we went in and sat, and I don't know what we had, Coke and coffee or something for an hour. And then we left. And as we're leaving, Ben turns to us and he says, you know what I'm going to do, boys, one day? One day when I come here, I'm going to grab Anna Dodge, I'm going to rub her titties and see what she does. Now, we were about 15 years old, right? We looked at each other, we couldn't believe it.
Well, now should we say about the trays?
Oh, God, yes, the
Favorite
trays.
trays.
Oh, geez.
One Christmas. Ben
Well, let me
bought-
start by saying that Ben used to send us things. For Thanksgiving,
Oh, yeah,
he would send us a turkey in Cleveland.
in Cleveland from Colorado.
But the caveat was, it was a live turkey. He would send a live turkey in a box to Cleveland.
It would arrive in the back door.
It arrived in the back
There
door.
wasn't a cake.
There was a live turkey. And we'd say to our dad, kill the turkey, kill the turkey. Now, our father didn't kill turkeys, believe me. Take it to a butcher, you know.
So once he brought us some presents, 2 presents that were wrapped up very, very neatly. They were square, about this big and this thin. They were a little like a picture frame or something. And we opened them up and there were trays. And the picture on the behind the trays were topless women.
Naked rubber.
They were topless, really. And my mother took one look and grabbed the trays and ran them into her.
That was the end of that. We never
We
saw
never
her
saw
again.
those trays again, except when we sneak in her.
Trying to find it, we never found it.
In her-
And our father, your great-grandfather Eugene, was furious. He said, Ben is a lawyer. He must know it's illegal to send pornography through the mail. He can't do that. That's why they were apprehensive when Ben invited us to go out to Rifle, Colorado and to Salt Lake City. And indeed, we did drive through red light districts.
Oh, he'd
Never
point out.
stop, but we'd point out, this is a red light district in this town, that's a red light district in this town.
Yeah. But Ben then came to Cleveland, and as we said, in his late 70s, early 80s. Probably in his early 80s, because he died at 89.
Yeah. No, 87, wasn't it?
Well, I
Boy
think
was 89.
Boy was 90.
I thought boy was 89.
Boy was 90. He was, maybe you're right.
I,
In any event,
I don't
maybe
think
you're right. In any event, he was in his 80s and getting pretty infirm, and he had an apartment in Cleveland, and caretakers taking care of him. And Ben, who had probably earned a lot of money during his life, had spent it on
A good
living,
life.
Good living.
He's been on a good
And
life.
He was taken care of at that point by my mother and her brother, our uncle, Bob Copper. And he'd spend most of his time in the apartment, couldn't go out too much, and finally died in 1961. I think it was the January of 61.
And he was buried in St. Louis.
Buried in St. Louis. And we, as a family, Mom, Dad, Joan, David, and I, took a train to St. Louis for the funeral.
I didn't go to St.
Remember
Louis.
the train? Oh, yes, you did.
I did.
3 of us sat up all night telling stories about Ben.
Oh, I guess I didn't go and
We
carry.
went to the funeral, and his gravestone is in St. Louis, next to his wife's, next to his parents, and actually, Gerda and the children, your mother, Amy, and her sisters, on our way west, once stopped in St. Louis. We went to the grave. and saw
Yeah.
the gravestones. And you have a tremendous heritage.
A great
in
heritage.
Koperlik.
He was, as we said initially, a great personality to emulate. Someone who had a fine mind, had a brilliant legal career in terms of things he did for people in Denver, in Pueblo, and had a distinguished reputation around the state.
Yeah.
He was well known politically, and he was socially the kind of guy you want to emulate in terms of friends and in terms of supporting relationships. He had some guys on the other side of the legal system who were in jail. He had a guy in Leavenworth that he corresponded with who'd been put in
He
jail.
said some of his best clients were in Leavenworth.
We're in
which is the
Leavenworth,
federal prison.
federal prison. He had a guy, he was a pen pal with a guy in federal penitentiary. And he loved to tell story, and then I think we've run out of gas, about how he defended a bootlegger during Prohibition. Prohibition was when the law prohibited drinking in this country, and that was in the late 20s. And he had a case for a bootlegger who was running liquor. And he said after the trial, he and the judge went into the judge's chambers and drank down all the evidence.
Drink the evidence.
They drank the evidence.
So you come from a line of lawyers beginning with Benjamin Franklin Koperlik, and then his son-in-law, who was Eugene Heitler Friedheim, your great-grandfather, and
His son,
his,
who was a lawyer, Isaac.
Ben's son was
Ben
an
was
attorney,
an attorney.
and Eugene's granddaughter,
Your mother.
your mother, Amy Jean Friedheim. So you are named for three lawyers: Benjamin, Eugene, and your
Robert.
mother,
Robert.
Friedheim.
Well, not named for that, but Robert.
His name, Benjamin Eugene Friedheim. So all three of them are attorneys. Whether you are a lawyer or not,
At least you got a
doesn't
great
matter.
heritage.
Doesn't matter.
You got a
You
great
got a great
heritage.
heritage, but whatever you do, you can be proud of your heritage, proud of your mother, and we wish you the
Yep.
very best and all the good wishes in your life.
And if nothing more, when my twin here and I are no longer around, you can look at this tape.
And say
And
those
think of
crazy
it.
brothers.
His brothers, they must have had a wonderful time, and we did. The other thing about Ben as a grandfather was that he was a compassionate, supportive, and a guy that we admired and could emulate, and I think that was very important in our lives.
Yeah. A very human.
Yeah, very human
Person.
guy. Very human guy. It's a good term. Very human guy, and yet one with great insight and great skill, and was highly respected for that.
An unforgettable character.
Unforgettable
I hope that
character.
You won't forget him.
Unforgettable
and that you'll
character.
pass on the legacy to your children.
Yeah.
And I gave your mother a Pendleton shirt, that, plaid shirt
That
that Ben used to wear when he did his abstracts.
Yeah,
It has a little patch in the corner, and when Ben died, I asked for that, and Mother gave it to me, and I just held on to it, and I still wear it from time to time. A little small for me.
There you go.
I passed it on to your mother, who will give it to you, and there aren't many children that will have a shirt from his great
Great.
grandfather.
Yeah.
Good luck.
Nice to see
Love
you, man.
you.
Take care,
55.
pal. Take care, pal. Makeup.
How do you turn this thing off?
Makeup.
Tell
Oh
Amy.
God.
Tell Amy.
Oh God. Okay.
Makeup.
Makeup. Recording session's over. We're done.
Oh, good. Did you hit the close button?
No. No.
Perfect timing.
Let's
Perfect timing.
put a lunch out.